Imagine you just spent, I don't know, $2 million in like 18 months building this absolutely state-of-the-art AI tool for human resources.
Right, yeah.
You've got your seed funding, you've got this massive wait list of eager enterprise clients, and your engineering team is, well, they're finally sleeping through the night.
A rare thing.
Exactly. You're completely ready to launch. And then literally overnight, the European Union tells you to halt everything because your product is supposedly too dangerous.
It's the ultimate nightmare scenario.
Yeah. And then Colorado tells you to rewrite your entire legal disclaimer or you're going to face a massive lawsuit.
Right.
The UK suddenly demands these structural changes to the third-party data centers that are just hosting your servers.
Which you don't even own.
Right. And then California chimes in and demands the literal receipts for every single piece of data you trained your model on, going back to day one.
I mean, you thought you were building a software product, and suddenly you're navigating this absolute labyrinth of international law.
So welcome to the deep dive. We are speaking directly to you today. The SaaS owners, the tech professionals, the founders, and the product managers who are probably currently staring at their roadmaps in a cold sweat.
And rightfully so.
Yeah. It is mid-May 2026, and we are looking at a truly monumental week in tech policy. Like a week that industry insiders are actually already calling the Great Recalibration.
And we have an incredibly dense stack of sources to get through to actually make sense of this for you.
Massive stack.
Yeah, we're looking at huge legislative updates, global policy trackers, and these deep dive legal analyses from firms like Littler, Alston and Bird, Pinsent Masons, Mayer Brown, and White & Case.
All the big players.
Right. Plus, we've got the raw text of California's SB 53 Trust and Safety Implementation Guides from TrustArc and comprehensive reports from the San Francisco Public Press and the UK government. We are covering the EU, Colorado, the UK, and California today.
And our mission today is very specific.
Yeah.
We are going to decode how the global regulatory engine it essentially slammed on the brakes. For the last 2 years, the entire focus of global governments was this panicked, kind of frantic rush toward preventing AI harm at literally all costs. But this week, that narrative pivoted so sharply.
It really did.
It shifted from preventing harm to governing for economic dominance. And by the end of this deep dive, we're going to extract a highly actionable 5-point survival checklist for your product roadmaps so you know exactly what to build, what to delay, and, what to prioritize right now.
Because the dates have moved. The rules of the game have completely changed. I mean, the penalty structures have been rewritten entirely. And the reality of building software in mid-2026 is that ignorance of the compliance pipeline is, well, it's going to cost you your company.
Okay, let's unpack this, because when you look at the events of this past week, it's like the world's regulators spent 2 years building a massive, highly intricate pressure cooker.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Right. They stuffed every possible fear about algorithmic bias, job displacement, and data privacy into it. They cranked the heat up to maximum, and then this week, they all just simultaneously looked at each other and agreed to release the valve before the entire tech economy exploded.
What's fascinating here is that the landscape has fundamentally shifted from this theoretical panic to operational reality. Lawmakers wrote these incredibly ambitious, philosophically grand rules to govern AI back in 2023 and 2024. Then they handed those laws to the regulatory bodies and the industries and just said, execute this.
Go figure it out.
Exactly. And everyone collectively realized that they couldn't. It was implementation friction on a global scale.
The tech just wasn't there.
No. The technical standards didn't exist. The audit frameworks weren't ready. The data tracking was, frankly, impossible. So governments were forced to compromise, not out of benevolence, right, but out of sheer logistical necessity.
And that takes us to the biggest domino to fall, I think. We have to start with the European Union, because they were the architects of the most rigid, comprehensive global AI framework in history.
Gold standard.
Supposedly, yeah. The EU AI Act was supposed to be the framework that the rest of the world would just copy. So when the EU blinks, the entire global tech sector feels the shockwave.
Absolutely. So on May 7, 2026, the European Council and the European Parliament reached this provisional political agreement on something called the Digital Omnibus on AI.
Right.
Officially, this was framed as a package of targeted amendments to the EU AI Act designed to, quote, simplify the digital regulatory framework.
Simplify. I mean, that word is doing an incredible amount of heavy lifting in that sentence.
Oh, definitely.
When a government says they are simplifying a regulation, it usually just means they realized it was too convoluted to actually enforce in the real world.
There is a lot of truth to that. But the most critical piece of this omnibus agreement, the part that had tech founders in, Berlin, Paris, and Silicon Valley just breathing a massive sigh of relief, is the timeline delay.
The Annex Third delay.
Yes, the delay for high-risk AI systems, which are categorized under Annex Third of the AI Act.
Just to level set for anyone who hasn't totally memorized the EU's categorization tiers, because it is dense, Annex Third covers the AI systems that directly impact people's lives, their rights, and their livelihoods.
The serious stuff.
Right. We're talking about AI used in biometric identification, management of critical infrastructure, education, employment like that resume screener we talked about earlier, and access to essential private services like credit scoring, law enforcement, migration.
Exactly.
If your SaaS touches literally any of those categories, you are caught in the Annex Third net.
And the original deadline for compliance with those high-risk obligations was staring the industry right in the face. August 2026.
Just months away.
Right. And the technical requirements to meet that deadline were staggering. You needed comprehensive risk management systems, continuous logging capabilities, extreme data governance protocols to ensure your training data sets were, free of errors and bias.
Which is almost mathematically impossible.
It is, and guaranteed human oversight mechanisms on top of that.
Yeah.
But the Omnibus Agreement pushed that enforcement deadline back by a massive 16 months.
Yeah.
The new deadline for standalone high-risk AI systems is now December 2, 2027. And if your high-risk AI is embedded in a regulated physical product as a safety component, say an AI diagnostic tool inside an MRI machine, you have until August 2, 2028.
I mean, that is a tectonic shift for a product roadmap.
Yeah.
Giving an engineering team an extra 16 months in the AI space is like giving them an extra decade in normal software development time.
Really is.
But wait, does this delay mean the EU is basically admitting their original plan was just completely unworkable from an engineering standpoint, or did the politicians simply run out of time to write the actual rules because they spent too much time arguing over definitions?
Yeah. Well, it is a profound mix of both, actually. From an engineering standpoint, creating a universal objective standard for what constitutes safe or unbiased AI across wildly different sectors. I mean, from predicting machine failure in a factory to evaluating a candidate for mortgage is a monumental, perhaps impossible task to do quickly.
Right. The context changes the math completely.
Exactly. But politically, the EU realized they were backing themselves into a corner. A regulation that gets continually delayed every time an enforcement deadline approaches loses its market credibility.
The Brussels effect.
Yes, the famous Brussels effect, the phenomenon where EU regulations become the de facto global standard simply because companies want access to the European market. It only works if the texts are binding, clear, and actually enforced.
Which they weren't.
No. The EU had to fix these new dates firmly now to save face and provide market certainty, even if the technical standards are still lagging way behind. They're just gambling that standard-setting bodies can finish the rulebook by 2027.
It's like a city passing a law saying all new buildings must be built with ultra-safe bricks. But the city hasn't actually published the definition of what an ultra-safe brick is, what it's made of, or how much it should weigh.
That is the exact scenario.
You can't penalize a construction company for stopping work when they literally don't know what material to use.
Right. Furthermore, the EU faced immense competitiveness pressure. The Commission's recent Digital Networks roadmap heavily emphasized European competitiveness.
Because they're losing startups.
They are terrified of stifling innovation, to the point where European AI startups just flee to the US or the UK, draining the continent of technological talent. Dropping the hammer on high-risk systems without clear guidelines would have essentially frozen European AI development overnight.
Investors would have pulled out immediately.
Exactly, and founders would have relocated.
Yeah.
So they bought themselves and the industry some critical breathing room.
But, and this is a massive but for anyone listening who builds consumer-facing apps, this was not a total retreat. They gave the industry 16 months on the complex enterprise compliance, sure, but they took the opportunity to introduce a completely new, incredibly strict prohibition.
Yes, they did.
We're calling it the nudifier fast track.
The omnibus negotiations weren't just about delays. Effective December 2, 2026, just a few months from now, the EU is enforcing a brand new prohibition under Article 5.
Right.
They are strictly banning AI systems that generate non-consensual intimate imagery, often referred to as NCII, or child sexual abuse material.
Yeah.
This is a direct, targeted strike at the proliferation of so-called nudifier apps and deepfake pornography generators.
Let's drill into the mechanics of this, because if you have a SaaS product that handles image generation or a multimodal model that users can interact with, you are suddenly on a very tight ticking clock.
You are.
It's not just about terms of service anymore. You can't just slap a disclaimer on there that says, please don't use our tool for bad things.
Absolutely not. Terms of service are no longer a defense. The law includes a safe harbor provision, but to actually utilize it, the provider must prove that the AI system has effective preventive safeguards mathematically and structurally designed into it.
Baked into the code.
Exactly. As the VerifyWise legal analysis pointed out, this requirement wasn't even in the Commission's original proposal. If you provide a general-purpose image generation model, you cannot promise to build safeguards reactively anymore.
So you can't just ban users after they do it.
No. That safe harbor design, the content filtering, the prompt blocking, the output scanning, needs to be a documented part of your core risk management architecture right now.
Wait, what if I'm just an app developer? Let's say I'm not training a massive foundation model. I'm just building a fun avatar generator app, and I'm plugging into someone else's foundation model through an API. Am I off the hook because I didn't build the core AI?
You are absolutely on the hook. Under the definitions of the AI Act, if you are building a downstream app using an API, the prohibition still applies to you because you are the provider of the system producing the final output in that specific context to the European consumer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you have to ensure that the API you are calling has those safeguards, and you have to implement your own moderation layer on top of it. If your app generates non-consensual intimate imagery, the EU will come after you, not just the company that built the API.
So the EU is really giving with one hand and taking with the other. They relieve the pressure on enterprise HR and healthcare tools for a year, but they drop a hard, fast ban on generative consumer outputs.
Exactly.
But I want to talk about what didn't change in this omnibus, because I know how tech Twitter works. People read a headline that says EU AI Act delayed, and they immediately tell their engineering teams to just scrap their compliance sprints entirely.
That would be a catastrophic assumption. Several operationally heavy, engineering-intensive requirements survived this simplification round completely intact.
Yeah.
Most notably, the Article 6.3 registration.
Let's talk about Article 6.3, because this sounds like bureaucratic paperwork, but it's actually a massive structural trap. Let's say I'm a developer, and I build an AI tool that sorts through customer service emails.
Yep.
Technically, some of that might touch Annex Third categories, depending on how it's used, but I look at my tool and say, actually, this isn't high risk. It only does low-level sorting. It doesn't make final decisions. It doesn't impact anyone's fundamental rights. I self-assess my tool as non-high risk. Originally, there was a proposal to let companies just keep that self-assessment internal, right?
There was. The Commission proposed deleting the obligation to register that self-assessment, but the Council and the Parliament fiercely fought back, and the obligation survived. This is crucial for founders to understand. Your self-assessment isn't just an internal memo that lives in a Google Doc on your legal team's shared drive.
It's not a private file.
It is a mandatory public filing.
What does that actually look like in practice? Am I just uploading a PDF to a government website?
It's much more structured than that. You have to input your system into the official EU AI database. You have to provide your technical parameters, your intended use cases, and explicitly legally defend your position that your system is not high risk, despite falling under an Annex Third category heading.
So it's heavily scrutinized.
Oh yeah. National competent authorities and the Central AI Office will have a continuously updated, highly searchable list of these borderline classification calls.
So you can't just quietly classify yourself out of scope, keep your head down, and hope nobody notices. You are essentially forced to stand up in a crowded room, wave a flag, and say, hey, regulators, look at my homework. I promise my algorithm isn't dangerous.
And that searchable database is exactly the kind of structured data that drives thematic regulatory enforcement sweeps.
Ah, of course.
If the AI office decides they want to crack down on employment algorithms, they don't have to go searching the internet. They just query the database for every company that self-assessed an HR tool as non-high risk and start sending audit demand letters.
It's a target list. They literally made the industry build their own target list.
Yes. Furthermore, the strict necessity standard for bias correction processing was preserved.
Which is huge.
It is. If you are auditing your AI to ensure it isn't biased against certain demographics, you often need to process special categories of sensitive personal data to run those tests. Data like race, health status, or sexual orientation.
Under GDPR, processing that data is heavily restricted.
Exactly. The AI Act provides an exception to process that data for bias correction, but only under a documented strict necessity justification. Industry lobbyists begged the EU to loosen that to just necessary, which would give data scientists much more leeway.
But the EU said no.
The EU refused. The strict necessity bar remains, meaning your data science team has to prove there was literally no other mathematical way to correct the bias without utilizing that sensitive data.
I want to touch on the reaction to this EU omnibus because it highlights the impossible tightrope regulators are currently walking. Tech industries and associations obviously celebrated the delay.
Naturally.
They called it a necessary innovation window, arguing you can't build a compliant product when the compliance standards don't exist yet. But consumer advocacy groups were absolutely furious.
The European Consumer Organization, or BEUC, issued scathing statements within hours of the omnibus agreement. They called it a move that creates a less safe digital environment for consumers.
Strong words.
Very strong. They argued that it rolls back fundamental protections that were fiercely debated and adopted barely a year ago. They view the delay as creating dangerous loopholes, expanding industry privileges, and essentially bowing to corporate lobbying. They are deeply concerned that removing critical AI systems from immediate oversight could undermine the fundamental rights the AI Act was supposed to guarantee. Now, we are impartial observers here, but the tension is palpable.
It really is. So the EU hits the pause button on proactive enforcement because they basically couldn't build the standards in time. But this implementation friction wasn't just a European problem.
Not at all.
Stateside, the very first U.S. state to pass a comprehensive AI law just realized they couldn't execute their vision either. And this led to a massive, frankly shocking legislative repeal. Let's look at the chaos in Colorado.
Colorado has been the most fascinating test case for U.S. state-level AI regulation. Back in May 2024, they passed a landmark bill, SB 24205.
Right, the big one.
It was heralded as the first comprehensive state AI law in America, and it was heavily modeled on the EU's proactive risk-based approach. It imposed heavy obligations on developers and deployers of high-risk AI systems used in consequential decisions, things like employment, housing, lending, and healthcare.
Stuff that really matters to everyday life.
Exactly. It demanded proactive risk management programs, mandatory algorithmic impact assessments, and a strict affirmative duty to use reasonable care to avoid algorithmic discrimination.
It was essentially the EU AI Act applied to the Rocky Mountains. And it was supposed to go into effect very soon. But then, on May 14th, 2026, literally the exact same week the EU is watering down its own timeline, Governor Jared Polis signs SB 26189. This new bill completely repeals the 2024 Act and replaces it entirely.
The tech sector was caught completely off guard by the sheer totality of the repeal, though the writing had been on the wall for a bit.
How so?
Well, the 2024 law had drawn intense, relentless criticism from the local business community. Small and medium-sized businesses looked at the requirement to conduct mandatory algorithmic impact assessments and realized they simply didn't have the capital to hire the specialized compliance teams or third-party auditors required to do that.
It was a death sentence for startups.
It felt like it to them. Even the White House, in previous statements, had referenced the Colorado model as a potentially overly burdensome framework that could stifle local economies. On top of that, there was a looming constitutional lawsuit filed by an AI company arguing that forcing developers to restrict their algorithms violated First Amendment rights regarding code as speech.
Oh, that's a wild angle.
Yeah, but that lawsuit had already prompted the Colorado Attorney General to agree to delay enforcement.
So the state looks at this law, realizes it's going to bankrupt their local tech startups and tie the state up in federal court for a decade. What did they do? Because they didn't just delay the effective date like the EU did. They rewrote the fundamental philosophy of how you regulate software.
This is a massive philosophical pivot. Colorado scrapped the preventive theory of AI governance entirely. The mandatory expensive bias audits, the proactive impact assessments, the requirement to affirmatively redesign your models to avoid algorithmic discrimination before deployment, that entire framework is gone.
Just wiped out.
Wiped out. They realized you cannot proactively audit a black box effectively without crushing the company building it. Instead, they replaced it with a framework focused on reactive transparency surrounding what they call automated decision-making technology, or ADMT.
Reactive transparency. Let's break down the new rules for the founders listening. If you are a SaaS business operating in Colorado and this law goes into effect on January 1st, 2027, what is actually required of you now? What's the new checklist?
It boils down to three primary operational requirements. First, you must provide a clear and conspicuous pre-use notice.
Okay, like a pop-up.
Basically. Before you use an ADMT to materially influence a consequential decision like screening a resume, approving a rental application, or determining a healthcare premium, you have to explicitly tell the consumer that AI is involved in the process.
Easy enough.
Second, if that AI decision results in an adverse outcome, say the person gets rejected for the apartment, you have 30 days to provide a post-adverse outcome disclosure.
So a rejection letter with context.
Exactly. This disclosure has to explain the role the AI played in the rejection, the data it looked at, and provide a simple process for the consumer to request more information.
Okay, notice and disclosure. That's essentially UI work and automated email triggers. That's highly manageable for a dev team. But it's the third requirement that I think is going to give SaaS founders absolute nightmares: the right to meaningful human review.
Yes. Consumers in Colorado now have the statutory right to correct factually inaccurate data that was fed into the AI, and they have the right to request a meaningful human review and reconsideration of that consequential decision.
I mean, I need to stop you there, because if I build an AI tool that processes 10,000 loan applications a day, the entire value proposition of my software is that my client doesn't need to pay 50 humans to review those loans.
Right. The efficiency is the product.
Exactly. If the law says every rejected applicant can demand a human look at their file, the efficiency of the AI is completely destroyed. My SaaS product becomes worthless to the client.
The lawmakers understood that exact tension, which is why they included a massive, highly debated caveat. The law states that employers and businesses only need to comply with this right to human review, quote, to the extent commercially reasonable.
Oh, wow. Commercially reasonable. That is a phrase perfectly designed to keep corporate litigators employed for the next 3 decades.
It absolutely is. As the legal analysis from Littler pointed out, the scope of that single phrase is going to be the central battleground in Colorado courts.
Oh, I bet.
If implementing a parallel manual human review process costs a company more in labor than the efficiency gained by using the AI tool in the first place, they will argue it is not commercially reasonable to provide that review.
I can already hear the arguments. A massive bank might be told it is commercially reasonable for them to hire 10 people to review AI loan rejections, but a 3-person property management startup will argue it would literally bankrupt them to manually review tenant rejections.
Right, the scale changes everything.
It's going to be a total gray area.
It will be tested case by case. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the most profound change in this new Colorado law, especially for the engineers and SaaS owners listening right now, is the new liability fault split. This fundamentally changes how you write your contracts.
Explain this fault split, because usually when software breaks and does something illegal, the person who bought the software blames the person who built it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Colorado's new law explicitly splits liability between the developer of the AI system and the deployer. The deployer being your SaaS customer.
Okay.
If a deployer uses your AI tool exactly as it was intended, perfectly following your documentation, and the tool still discriminates against a protected class, the developer is liable. However, if the deployer uses the AI in a way it was not intended or documented to be used, or ignores the limitations you stated, the developer is shielded from liability, and the deployer takes the full legal hit.
So think about the hypothetical SaaS founder building an API for mortgage lending. It's like they are manufacturing a high-performance sports car.
I like that analogy.
Right. Under the old rules, if the buyer drove the car off a cliff, the manufacturer might get sued for not building a cliff avoidance system. Under the new Colorado rules, if the manufacturer provides a clear, highly specific instruction manual that says, do not drive this car off a cliff, it is only designed for paved highways, and the buyer drives it off a cliff anyway, the manufacturer is protected. The buyer pays the damages.
That is a perfect analogy. Colorado is making a profound regulatory trade here. They are trading proactive algorithmic safety, which requires expensive, impossible technical audits, for reactive accountability, which is essentially paper trails and contract law.
Fascinating.
For AI developers, your technical documentation is no longer just a wiki page for developers. It is your ultimate legal shield. Furthermore, the law explicitly voids indemnification clauses that attempt to shift liability for a party's own acts of discrimination.
Wait, explain that, because every SaaS contract I've ever seen has a clause that essentially says the customer holds us harmless and indemnifies us if they use our tool to do something illegal.
You can no longer rely on those boilerplate clauses in Colorado. The law nullifies them if they attempt to bypass this fault split. You cannot contract your way out of liability if your algorithm is fundamentally biased.
Wow.
Your only protection is providing a standardized technical dossier that clearly, exhaustively defines the intended uses, the required data inputs, and the strict limitations of your product.
So if you build a resume screening tool, your technical documentation needs to say in bold, unmissable text. This tool is designed strictly to parse technical keywords from software engineering resumes. It is not designed to evaluate cultural fit, leadership potential, or language proficiency. Using this tool to evaluate anything other than technical keywords violates the intended use and voids our liability.
Exactly. You are insulating your company through hyper-specific, legally binding documentation. And when a consumer requests a human review because they suspect discrimination, the burden of proving that the AI was used correctly and within the bounds of that documentation falls squarely on the deployer.
It is a fascinating contrast. The EU delayed their strict rules because they couldn't figure out the complex engineering standards. Colorado just threw out the strict engineering rules entirely and said, it's too expensive to audit the math, just tell consumers you're using it, write a really good instruction manual, and we'll figure out who to sue later based on who didn't read the manual.
It's a completely different paradigm.
But while the EU delayed and Colorado rewrote, the UK looked at this absolute chaos of AI-specific legislation, the arguments over definitions, the impossible audit standards, the lawsuits, and they decided to bypass the concept almost entirely.
The United Kingdom's approach is a masterclass in strategic divergence. On May 13, 2026, during the King's speech setting out the government's legislative agenda, the UK confirmed what many policy wonks suspected. They are definitively splitting from the EU's legislative model.
Wow.
There will be no standalone comprehensive UK AI Act in 2026.
No AI Act at all. They're just letting the algorithms run wild. How are they managing the massive risks everyone else is panicking about?
They are adopting what policy analysts are calling the regulating for growth doctrine. The UK is looking at AI not as a distinct, monolithic danger that needs to be contained with its own bespoke set of laws, but as a utility flowing through existing infrastructure.
Like electricity.
Exactly. They've decided to focus entirely on the pipes rather than the water flowing through them. The UK government believes that regulating the underlying infrastructure, the data centers, the cloud providers, the cybersecurity networks, is the most effective way to control AI without stifling the software innovation layer and the economic growth it promises.
I have to challenge this logic, though, because ignoring the AI algorithms to focus strictly on data centers and supply chains, isn't that kind of like putting heavy-duty titanium locks on the front door of your house, but ignoring the fact that a burglar is already sitting in your living room?
Right, because the software is already inside.
The AI model itself can hallucinate, discriminate, or generate malware. Securing the server it sits on doesn't change the algorithm's output.
I see the logic in that analogy, and consumer advocates have raised that exact point. But the UK government would counter your analogy by saying that if you completely control the power supply, the structural integrity of the house, and the communication lines going in and out, it doesn't matter if the burglar is in the living room. The burglar is trapped and powerless.
Interesting.
The primary vehicle for this strategy is the new Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill, which fundamentally reforms the existing network and information systems regulations, known as the NIS regulations.
So what does this cybersecurity bill actually do to the infrastructure?
It massively expands the scope of who is legally considered critical infrastructure.
Right.
It brings data centers and managed service providers, or MSPs, directly into scope as essential services.
Pause right there. You're telling me a B2B IT service that manages cloud storage for mid-sized businesses is now regulated under the same category as a municipal water treatment plant or a nuclear power grid.
That is exactly what I'm saying.
That's intense.
If you operate a data center over a certain capacity threshold, or if you provide B2B IT management services where you have privileged access to your customers' networks, you are now critical infrastructure. And the government has added a new sweeping designation for critical suppliers.
Critical suppliers.
The UK government can now designate specific third-party software or hardware suppliers as critical if an incident affecting their systems could cause significant disruption to essential services. Think about the June 2024 ransomware attack on Synovis, a pathology supplier to the National Health Service.
Oh, that was awful.
That single attack on a third-party vendor caused over 11,000 postponed medical appointments across London. The UK looked at that and realized they needed direct, punitive regulatory oversight over those weak links in the supply chain.
And the incident reporting requirements they've attached to this designation are brutal. From an engineering standpoint, they almost seem physically impossible.
They are arguably the strictest cyber reporting requirements we have seen globally. Under the new UK bill, these covered entities must provide an initial notification to the regulator within 24 hours of becoming aware of a significant incident.
24 hours. I mean, I have to put my SaaS founder hat on here. 24 hours is barely enough time for a security team to figure out if an alert is a false positive caused by a server reboot, let alone draft a legally binding regulatory notification.
Exactly.
When a breach happens, the first 24 hours is pure chaos. You're isolating servers, checking logs, trying to stop the bleeding. You don't have time to fill out government paperwork. A 24-hour notification is essentially just going to be a panic Slack message to the regulator saying, something break, we don't know what, please don't fine us.
And regulators will tell you that is exactly the point.
Really?
Yes. The UK wants early warning, not a polished PR-scrubbed post-mortem. They want to know the house might be on fire while there is still time to send the fire trucks, rather than waiting 3 weeks for the company to confirm exactly which room burned down first.
That makes sense from their side.
You provide that initial alert in 24 hours, and then the law gives you 72 hours to provide a full, detailed report covering the nature, scope, and impact of the incident. Furthermore, data centers and managed service providers must actively notify their UK customers if those customers are likely to be adversely affected by the breach.
How does this compare to what the EU is doing with their own infrastructure security? Because the EU has the NIS2 directive coming online. Are they aligned, or is this another headache for multinational companies?
As the Mayer-Brown analysis highlights, a compliance strategy designed solely for the EU's NIS2 will fail in the UK. There are crucial differences.
Of course there are.
First, the UK directly regulates these critical suppliers, pulling them under the regulator's thumb. NIS2, generally speaking, pushes supply chain security down to the essential entities themselves, forcing the hospital to secure its vendors rather than the government directly regulating the vendor.
That's a big shift in burden.
Second, the UK requires that proactive customer notification, which NIS2 handles differently. But the most terrifying difference for corporate boards is the penalty structure.
Let's talk money. Because nothing changes corporate behavior faster than fines. What happens if a data center or an MSP experiences a breach and fails to report it in that impossible 24-hour window?
The UK has introduced a devastatingly high-tiered penalty regime. For the most serious failures, which explicitly includes security breaches and the failure to meet incident notification deadlines, the maximum penalty is the greater of £17 million, or 4% of the company's worldwide annual turnover.
4% of global revenue. So if a massive cloud provider misses a 24-hour email deadline by an hour while they are trying to patch a zero-day exploit, the UK government can take 4% of their global revenue.
That is the threat. So you can see the strategy. They aren't regulating the AI models directly. They aren't asking how the algorithm makes a decision, but they are absolutely terrifying the infrastructure providers who host those models into maintaining Fort Knox levels of security and incident response.
It's brute force.
By raising the financial stakes so astronomically high on infrastructure failures, they're forcing resilience from the ground up. It's a pragmatic, growth-first approach. Let the AI developers innovate freely at the software layer, but ensure the hardware, the data centers, and the managed services hosting them are virtually impenetrable and highly accountable to the state.
Okay, we've seen the EU delay their rules out of technical friction. We've seen Colorado repeal their law out of operational friction. And we've seen the UK pivot entirely to infrastructure to protect economic growth. It feels like a massive global pullback from regulating AI software.
It really does.
But amidst this great recalibration, one major player refused to yield completely: California. Home to the world's biggest AI developers, the frontier itself.
California is a fascinating case study in legislative endurance. While other regions were retreating or pivoting, California's legislature was fighting a pitched, highly public battle over Senate Bill 53, the Transparency and Frontier Artificial Intelligence Act.
Right.
State Senator Scott Wiener has been pushing this aggressively, trying to walk a razor-thin line between balancing public safety against catastrophic risks and protecting the state's massive innovation economy.
And May 14th was a critical day for this bill. It was the dreaded suspense file day in the California Assembly Appropriations Committee.
A huge hurdle.
For those who don't follow state politics, the suspense file is where expensive bills go to die silently without a public vote. It's the legislative graveyard. But SB 53 survived. It moved to a floor vote with an effective date of January 1st, 2026.
It survived, yes, but it limped out of committee with significant battle scars. The intense lobbying from the tech industry, including organizations like TechNet and companies with literally trillions of dollars in market capitalization, profoundly shaped the final version of the bill.
Let's define the scope first, because this is vital for our audience. Who does SB 53 actually apply to? Because a lot of SaaS founders read about this and panicked. But this isn't for your average startup building a wrapper around OpenAI's API, right?
No. SB 53 is surgically targeted at the absolute titans of the industry. It applies only to large developers who train massive foundation models using a quantity of computing power greater than 10 to the 26th power integer or floating point operations, commonly referred to as FLOPS.
10 to the 26th FLOPS. Let's put that in human terms. That is an astronomical amount of compute. To hit that threshold, you are talking about spending hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, just on the raw data center time and electricity required to train the model over months.
Exactly.
It's an exclusionary threshold. We're talking about OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, Meta, XAI. We are not talking about a Series A startup in a garage.
Exactly. And the bill also includes a secondary revenue threshold of over $100 million, so it exclusively captures the bleeding edge of the frontier.
Yeah.
Under the bill, these massive developers are required to publish safety and security protocols detailing exactly how they assess and mitigate catastrophic risks, which the bill narrowly defines as an incident causing over $1 billion in damages or resulting in mass casualties.
Heavy stuff.
They have to report critical safety incidents directly to the Attorney General, and they must provide strong, legally protected whistleblower channels for employees who want to raise alarms about safety issues.
But you mentioned the lobbying effort. The teeth of this bill were filed down significantly in the final weeks before it passed the suspense file.
Drastically filed down. Let's look at the compromises that allowed it to survive. First, look at the financial penalties. Originally, the bill proposed $10 million fines for events that caused mass injury or billion-dollar damages.
Okay.
Under pressure, that was slashed to $1 million for a first offense.
Wow.
As critics rightly pointed out, a $1 million fine for companies valued in the trillions is essentially a rounding error. It is the cost of doing business, not a deterrent against releasing a dangerous model.
And the incident reporting requirements for hacking changed too, right? This was a huge point of contention for security researchers.
Yes, and this is where it gets highly technical. The original draft required AI companies to report any cyber intrusion involving the theft or unauthorized modification of core code, specifically the model weights.
Right.
Security experts argue that stealing model weights is a catastrophic event because it allows malicious actors, say a nation-state, to take the raw intelligence of the model, strip away all the safety guardrails, and use it to create things like bioweapons or launch automated cyber attacks.
It's the keys to the kingdom.
Exactly. But the final bill watered this down dramatically. Companies only have to report hacking incidents to the state if the hack actually results in physical injury or death.
Wait. So a foreign intelligence agency could hack an AI lab in San Francisco, steal the model weights for the most advanced AI in the world, and as long as nobody gets physically hurt during the hack, the company doesn't legally have to tell the government.
Under the final text of SB 53, that appears to be the case.
That's wild.
So your analogy earlier was apt. California set out to build a regulatory fortress, but lobbyists essentially convinced them to leave the back door unlocked and let the companies redact the blueprints.
Speaking of redacting blueprints, that was another major concession, wasn't it?
Yes. The final law allows AI companies to redact trade secrets from their published safety plans. And crucially, it does not give the government the authority to privately review those redactions to see if the company is hiding safety failures under the guise of intellectual property.
They just have to take their word for it.
Compare that to New York's Pending Raise Act, which mandates reporting of hacking if there is even a potential for serious harm, and explicitly allows the New York Attorney General to inspect redacted sections of safety plans in a secure facility. California chose to trust the companies.
So SB 53 is a bit of a paper tiger compared to its original vision. It targets 5 companies and lets them redact their homework. But I want to pivot, because California isn't just relying on SB 53. They have companion transparency laws that passed alongside it, AB 2013 and SB 942, and these laws actually do have teeth for the broader SaaS market. This is where the founders listening need to pay very close attention.
These 2 laws are arguably far more impactful for the average tech company because they establish a stringent, non-negotiable regime of AI provenance. Let's start with AB 2013. This law focuses intensely on the inputs of AI.
The training data.
Yes, if
Yeah.
you release a new or substantially modified generative AI system in California, you must publish incredibly detailed documentation about your training data on your website.
And this isn't just a brief, high-level summary that says, we trained this on the internet. The compliance guides from TrustArc break this down. The era of move fast and scrape things is officially dead in California.
It really is.
You need high-level dataset summaries. You need IP and privacy flags, meaning you have to publicly disclose if the data you scraped contains copyrighted material or personal information protected under the CCPA. You need to document the exact acquisition details, the processing history, and declare whether you use synthetic data generated by other AIs.
It forces engineering and compliance teams to stand up data lineage management as a core governance function. Data acquisition has to become a forensic science. You need a strict chain of custody for every megabyte of data, and the implications for specific sectors are massive.
Let's explore a hypothetical here to show how dangerous this is. Imagine a mid-sized health tech startup. They build an AI tool that summarizes patient histories for doctors. To train this AI, they partnered with a local hospital and used a massive data set of patient records.
Risky move.
Right. They ran it through a scrubbing tool, so they think it's de-identified. But under AB 2013, they have to publicly post a summary of their data set.
Exactly. And in that summary, they have to disclose the source of the data and whether it included protected health information or PHI. If they state they used PHI, even if they claim it was de-identified, they've just painted a massive target on their back for federal regulators.
Oh, no.
They had to balance AB 2013's absolute disclosure mandate with HIPAA's strict confidentiality rules. One poorly phrased sentence in a publicly posted AB 2013 dataset summary could trigger a massive multi-million-dollar federal HIPAA's violation audit. The friction between state transparency and federal privacy is going to catch a lot of startups completely off guard.
And then there's the other side of the coin, SB 942, the California AI Transparency Act. If AB 2013 is about the inputs, SB 942 focuses on the outputs.
Yes. SB 942 applies to generative AI providers with over 1 million monthly users in California. It mandates two very specific types of disclosures for AI-generated content. First, manifest disclosures. These are visible labels that a human can see, like a watermark on an image or text overlay that says, generated by AI.
Okay, that's standard.
Second, and much more technically difficult, are latent disclosures. This is embedded, cryptographic metadata hidden within the file itself, containing the provider's name, the system version that created it, and a precise creation timestamp. Plus, you have to provide a free, publicly accessible tool on your website where anyone can upload a file to detect whether your system created it.
I want to focus on the latent metadata because this is where the policy meets intense engineering reality. How do you embed data into an image so that it survives someone taking a screenshot on an iPhone or cropping it or compressing it to send over WhatsApp?
That is the million-dollar engineering challenge of 2026. It is not just a visual watermark that someone can easily crop out or clone stamp over in Photoshop. It involves advanced techniques like steganography, where the metadata is mathematically encoded into the microscopic noise of the image itself, making it invisible to the eye but detectable by software. Or it involves adopting complex industry-wide cryptographic protocols like the C2PA standard, which binds the metadata to the file at the point of creation. But you're right, if a user takes an analog screenshot of a digital image, the metadata is often stripped. California is demanding that companies find a way to make that metadata persistent across transformations, which pushes the boundaries of current computer science.
And this has massive implications beyond just stopping deepfakes. Think about the financial sector. Think about SEC and FINRA record retention rules. If a financial institution uses a generative AI tool to draft an investor presentation or summarize a client meeting in an email, that document must have the AI label and the embedded metadata.
Exactly.
And under SEC Rule 17A4, the financial firm has to retain that original metadata-rich version in a non-rewritable format for years in case of a federal audit.
Precisely. California is setting the absolute standard for provenance. Despite the political compromises on frontier safety models in SB 53, they're making it legally perilous to operate a black box AI system in their jurisdiction. Transparency is no longer a marketing buzzword. It is becoming a strict, non-negotiable operational mandate.
Okay, we've covered the global chessboard. We've seen the politics, the pushback, the delays, and the pivots. We've talked about the EU's 16-month delay because they couldn't define the standards. Colorado's reactive shift because audits bankrupt small businesses.
Mm.
The UK's infrastructure chokehold because algorithms are too hard to catch.
Oh.
And California's transparency mandates because they want the receipts. Now, let's bring it directly home to the listener. How does a SaaS owner, a product manager, a founder actually navigate this great recalibration?
Let's get into it.
We promised a 5-point action checklist for mid-May 2026, and we are going to run through it right now, step by step, as a strategic consulting session. Grab your roadmaps.
Ready when you are. Point 1.
Remap your implementation timeline.
This is your immediate, most impactful budgetary action. You need to open your product roadmap today and physically move your EU Annex 3rd high-risk compliance deadlines to Q1 2027 and your Colorado high-risk deadlines to December 2027.
Just push them back.
Yes. If you had capital allocated for expensive, panic-driven third-party bias audits or massive compliance restructuring in Q3 or Q4 of this year, you need to reallocate that budget immediately. Put that capital toward growth, user acquisition, or building deeper product features.
Use the runway.
Exactly. The pressure is off for the heavy, proactive compliance for now. Do not waste this innovation window burning cash on standards that don't even exist yet.
Point 2, conduct a nudifier audit.
Right, so do not let the EU delay lull you into a false sense of security here. While the complex enterprise stuff was delayed, the absolute ban on AI generating non-consensual intimate imagery and child sexual abuse material hits in 6 months on December 10, 2026.
That is coming up fast.
Very fast. If your SaaS handles any form of user-uploaded imagery or video, especially if you incorporate any generative or manipulative AI features, even via a third-party API, you must audit your moderation layer immediately. You need to structurally prove you have safeguards against non-consensual manipulation to gain the safe harbor protection.
And if you can't?
If you cannot mathematically guarantee that your moderation layer works by December, you need to geo-block those specific generative features for all EU IP addresses entirely.
Wow. Okay. Point 3, draft your technical dossier.
Capitalize on Colorado's new fault split. The era of vague, aspirational marketing copy for AI features is over. Saying, our AI magically finds the best candidates is now a massive liability.
Right, no more magic.
You need to create standardized, highly specific, lawyer-approved technical documentation for your customers. Detail exactly what your decision-making features are intended to do, the specific data inputs required for accuracy, and more importantly, what they are explicitly not intended to do. Outline all known limitations and error rate.
Which protects you.
Exactly. By providing this clear, restrictive manual, you insulate yourself as the developer from liability if your customer misuses the tool and triggers an algorithmic discrimination claim. Your documentation is your armor.
Point 4, update UK incident reporting.
If you operate data centers, or if you act as a managed service provider handling IT infrastructure for UK businesses, your world just sped up dramatically. You need to drill your security and legal teams immediately. Ensure your infrastructure monitoring and your incident response protocols can hit that punishing 24-hour notification window for significant cyber events.
And that's not just a technical fix.
No, it's not just about technical patching. It's about having a pre-approved communication pipeline to the UK regulators and automated notification systems for your affected customers. Run tabletop exercises, because if you can't report an incident within 24 hours, you face fines up to 4% of your global turnover. That is company-ending money.
Point 5, adopt Article 50 labeling.
While the EU moved the high-risk baits, they kept the transparency deadlines largely intact. The requirement under Article 50 to clearly label AI-human interactions like customer service chatbots remains active for August 2026.
So really soon.
Yes, and California's SB 942 mandates visible and embedded labeling for generative outputs. Do not delay your transparency UI notices. Implement the front-end changes to notify users they are talking to an AI, and begin the complex back-end engineering work of integrating persistent metadata embedding into your asset generation pipelines.
So what does this all mean? I want to step into the shoes of the overwhelmed developer here. If I'm a founder listening to this, my head is spinning. I have a burn rate to manage, anxious investors to update, a sales team begging for new features, and a product that just needs to ship.
I hear that constantly.
Right. I cannot do all 5 of these things this month. If I only have the engineering bandwidth to tackle one single item on this list right now, what is the absolute highest priority to keep my company alive?
The immediate, undeniable priority is point 5, transparency and provenance. The labeling and the metadata.
Really? Point 5.
Yes. Everything else on the list is largely back-end compliance, legal documentation, or delayed until 2027. But output labeling is the most visible external-facing compliance metric you have. If your tool generates images, text, or decisions, and you try to hide the fact that it's AI, you aren't just risking a quiet regulatory audit down the line.
We're risking trust.
You are causing immediate, catastrophic reputational damage with your users, and you are inviting instant legal scrutiny under California law and the surviving EU transparency rules. Anyone can see if your chatbot doesn't identify itself. Anyone can check your images for metadata.
That makes total sense.
This raises an important question for every engineering team listening today. How quickly can you build that latent metadata? The system version, the creation timestamp, the provider ID into your existing asset pipelines? Can you ensure that metadata persists even if a user crops a photo or copies a text block?
It's a huge technical hurdle.
That is the defining engineering challenge of Q3 2026.
Right.
Because if you can solve the provenance problem, you solve 80% of the immediate actionable regulatory pressure on your business.
That is incredibly clear. Solve provenance first, worry about the proactive audits later. So to summarize the massive tectonic shifts we've decoded today, the EU blinked on high-risk engineering standards, realizing you can't enforce rules you haven't written, and bought the industry 16 months of breathing room. Colorado realized proactive audits kill small businesses and swapped to a reactive documentation-heavy fault split, making your instruction manual your best legal defense.
Exactly.
The UK decided algorithms are too abstract to catch, so they're putting 24-hour reporting chokeholds on the physical data centers hosting them. And California survived immense tech lobbying to enforce strict metadata embedding and exhaustive training data transparency.
The dates have moved, yes, but the fundamental requirement to be accountable has not. We are no longer operating in the Wild West of AI development. We have moved firmly into a phase of structured, highly documented, legally defensive engineering.
And that leads to a final thought I want to leave you with as you go back to your roadmaps. For years, since the launch of ChatGPT and the subsequent generative boom, opacity was considered a feature of AI. It was a black box of magic. You put a prompt in, magic happened in the hidden layers, and incredible value came out. But as we've seen from the events of this week, opacity is now a massive structural liability.
It absolutely is.
If the entire global regulatory framework is shifting away from proving your AI is mathematically safe to simply explaining exactly how it works, where the data came from, and who is responsible when it breaks, we have to ask a difficult question. Will extreme transparency become your product's greatest competitive advantage in a market desperate for trust, or will it become its biggest security flaw as you expose your internal architecture to the world? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the great recalibration. Grab that 5-point checklist, sit down with your product and legal teams, and start mapping out your survival strategy. We'll see you next time.